Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Brown Bag webinar for August. I'm Rowena Zimmerman, the Director of Communications and Outreach for Blue Ridge PRISM, and we're just gonna just wait a few minutes to let everyone sign on. In the meantime, we always ask people if you're willing to type into the chat function, the chat box, where you are dialing in from. We love to see where our audience is. Thanks again and welcome. Norfolk, Richmond, Central Virginia, Georgia, Pocahontas State Park, Asheville, beautiful area. Welcome. Annapolis, Nelson. So good to see everyone. For all of you just coming on, we're going to be starting in just a minute or so. We're just letting everyone in the audience sign on. We have around little over 300 people who signed up for today. So we just want to give everyone a chance to get into the webinar before we start. If you have any questions, please just type them into the chat box and we will be happy to answer them. Welcome, everyone. We're just going to wait a minute or so while people are logging into the webinar. In the meantime, we're asking people just to type in the chat box. Any questions you might have for us right now as it relates to the Zoom, and also let us know what you where you're dialing in from. We'd love to know where you all are from. Thank you. Hi, Laura. Nice to see you. Okay, so that's me. I'm the one in charge of the deep dive fund. My quirky humor. Someone asked if who was in charge of the deep dive fund. Anyway, I think it's a few minutes after now, so we're going to get started. Once again, as everyone is dialing in, welcome to our August summer webinar for Blue Ridge PRISM, and where everyone right now is just typing in where they're from. And we're just going to be starting in actually just a second here, because it is a few minutes after 12. We're really happy that you have joined us here today. Okay, so we're going to get started now. Welcome. My name is Rowena Zimmerman, and I am the Director of Communications and Outreach for Blue Ridge PRISM. We're really happy that you all have joined us here today. Today's Brown Bag webinar is about aquatic invasive plants, which are becoming an increasing concern in Northern Virginia, especially, but is coming down throughout the state and will probably be an issue throughout Virginia. So we're really happy to have our panel here with us today. And I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping with you to make sure that if you have any issues, we can help you. If you can't hear us, make sure that your Zoom audio is connected correctly and that you've joined the computer audio in Zoom. There should be something at the bottom of your screen that tells you to join the audio. And that is in the lower left-hand setting, the lower left-hand corner, sorry, the audio settings. So make sure you click on that menu. And if that still doesn't work, you might have to leave the meeting and join again. Just wanted to give a shout out to another one of our events that's coming up. We have our Blue Ridge PRISM Invasive Plant Workshop at Blandy Experimental Farm, which is the State Arboretum of Virginia, which we haven't had a workshop there in a really long time. So that is later this August. And if you are interested in joining, we have just a few more spots left. Please go onto our website and you can register. More Zoom tips later on. We're going to have a short question and answer period with our panelists. But if you have any questions, but feel free throughout this meeting to input your questions. We ask that you put them in and type them in under the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. The chat function is just for you to basically share information that you want with the rest of the audience, or say hello, or tell us where you're from. But if you have questions for us or for our panelists, please put them in the Q&A tab. Now I'd like to go ahead and introduce our panelists. Once again, this is our Blue Ridge PRISM Brown Bag webinar for the summer of 2023, a deep dive into aquatic invasive plants. Welcome. Joining us today is Kevin Heffernan, who is the stewardship biologist for the Natural Heritage Program for the Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation. Shannon Jr., who's an aquatic ecologist for Solitude Lake Management, and Scott Barron, who's an urban conservation specialist for the Northern Virginia Soil and Water Conservation District. Starting us off will be Shannon, who's just going to give us an overview of aquatic invasives, so everyone here just gets a general idea of what they are and why they're an issue. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Shannon, are you ready to share yours?
I'm not, it's not giving me permission. Ah, here we go. I think now I can.
You all set?
I think so. Let's see, there we go. As you can see, I have quite a few windows open on my screen. Let's see.
Okay. All righty.
Sorry, there's too much. I can't. Yeah. Sorry, I can't get it into slideshow mode because I can't see. Everything's covering my. Okay, sorry, I can't.
That looks pretty good to us. So
okay,
feel free to start. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, I'm Shannon Jr. I work for Solitude Lake Management. I'm an aquatic ecologist. I've been about 23 years dealing with invasive and aggressive species. So I guess to start with a definition, what is nuisance aquatic vegetation? Basically, it's a plant that's growing where you don't want it, or where it affects the aesthetic, ecological, recreational, or functional integrity of the water body. So with that definition, some native species could even be considered nuisance if they're aggressive. So there is a little bit of a distinction there. And then why are exotic invasive species bad? They outcompete native species. They generally provide inferior habitat value for our native wildlife, and too much of anything can be bad. So if you have too many plants in your pond, it can definitely adversely affect your water quality. So briefly, I'm going to go over just the factors that contribute to excessive plant growth, some different types of nuisance vegetation, and then talk about pest management strategies. So what are some of the factors that cause excessive growth of nuisance plants? Basically, it's nutrients, water depth, and weather are some of the main factors, and I'll go over those more. So nitrogen and phosphorus are fertilizers. So when those substances get into our water bodies, they do the same thing in ponds that they do in our lawns and gardens. They increase plant growth. So having excessive nutrient levels can cause proliferation of unwanted vegetation. Nutrients get in the water body from everywhere in the watershed. There's also atmospheric deposition. It comes from agricultural sources, municipal sources, residential sources. as you're getting runoff coming into a water body, these substances start accumulating in the water. In freshwater, it's really phosphorus that's the biggest concern. It's what we call the limiting nutrient. And what's unique about phosphorus is not only does it come from those external sources, it also comes from inside the pond. So when you have low dissolved oxygen down near the sediment water interface, then biologically available phosphorus can release out of the sediment into the water column. Depth is also an important factor. Basically, the photic zone in a water body is the depth to which enough light can penetrate for plants to photosynthesize. So in shallow water bodies and backyard ponds, in many cases, especially if there's clear water, the sun enough light can penetrate all the way to the bottom. So you can literally have the entire pond or lake as a substrate for nuisance plants. This illustrates that a little bit better. If you think of a large lake, you have that littoral zone around the edge of the water body where plants can grow because the sunlight can get there. Whereas in the deeper water of the lake, you have that profundal zone where there's just not enough light. So you often hear that there's the recommendation to have, 15 or 20% coverage with vegetation for a healthy water body. That's much easier to manage in a lake that has deep water areas, whereas in a pond, it's much harder to maintain that percentage. The weather is also definitely a factor. Just generally, warm water can't hold as much oxygen as cold water. So the beneficial bacteria that break down organic matter, they like a lot of oxygen. So when you don't have enough oxygen, those bacteria just aren't working as well, and you'll get a larger accumulation of those nutrients. Same with dry periods. If you're not getting rain events, then water bodies aren't circulating and they can become stagnant. And again, you can get low oxygen. So during those times, we talked about that release of the phosphorus. So in the summer, there's not only the phosphorus coming into the water body, but then you've also got a lot of that release from the sediment. So just to briefly go over different types of nuisance vegetation, there's sort of 4 categories that we talk about. Submersed plants, those are the ones on the far right there. They are plants that are rooted in the bottom and they grow completely beneath the water surface. So just some kind of common examples. Hydrilla is probably the worst one that we deal with. It's an exotic. It is extremely persistent. The tubers can last for a decade, and it can be really devastating to the ecological community of a water body if it becomes if it takes over. Eurasian water milfoil is another one that can be extremely invasive. It's not as common, at least in Virginia. It's a little bit more common as you go north, but there's definitely, it's definitely moving. Curly leaf pondweed is an interesting one. It is the first thing to grow in the spring, but it's not very tolerant of warm water. So it sort of goes into senescence during the midsummer when the water gets really warm. So a lot of times people think it's gone, but then when fall rolls around, it comes back again. Emergent plants, those are the ones, they're shown on the far left there. They're the ones that are rooted in the bottom, but then the plant matter extends up above the water surface. So probably the most common example everyone's familiar with it are cattails. Cattails, again, native species, great for habitat. I think they look beautiful. They are really good for water quality, but they are extremely aggressive plants and they can take over. So that's one instance where it's probably one of the more common native species that we actually do have to manage at times. Water primrose, really aggressive plant. I swear it grows like a foot a day, and it's also difficult to control. It takes frequent aggressive treatments to get it under control. Parrot feather is another one. It's sort of pretty. So when you first see it, maybe it doesn't seem like it's that bad, but before you know it, it's everywhere. Then there's the floating plants. So floating plants can either be rooted in the bottom with the leaves floating on the surface, or they can just be free floating on the surface of the water. Water shield is probably one of the most common ones, at least in my area. We get calls all the time. People think they have water lilies, and it's in fact water shield. Its nickname is snot bonnet because it has this slimy coating on the bottom of the leaf. And it's another one that is a native plant, but in shallow water bodies, it will grow across the entire surface, which is not really good for the ecology of the pond. Two-horned water chestnut, we're going to hear a lot more about this one. We've treated it in hundreds of ponds in the Virginia area, and it is very, very aggressive. So we'll hear more about that one again. Yellow floating heart is really an aggressive plant. Again, it's not as common in Virginia where I work, but it is very common, like in Rappahannock County, some in Fauquier County, and we're starting to see it in other areas as well. So keep an eye out for that one. Water meal, if you've ever seen a pond that is bright green and it looks like you can walk across the surface of it, that is probably water meal. It is the smallest seed-bearing plant in the world. It just reproduces extremely rapidly. Again, native plant, but it can smother a water body. And duckweed is closely related to that. They actually are together in ponds quite often, and you might not even notice it. And then next thing you know, it's covering the entire surface of your water body. Algae are not really considered vegetation. They don't have roots, stems, or leaves, but they are common in ponds, obviously. They can be the base of the food chain, but then there's also some nuisance species. Particularly the biggest concern is cyanobacteria. It's not actually an algae, although it is often called blue-green algae. It's a photosynthetic bacteria. And the reason that is such a concern is because many of these algae species actually produce toxins that can be very harmful to humans, wildlife, and the environment. You may have heard of some dog deaths around the country. There's been a link between some of the algal toxins and Alzheimer's and Lou Gehrig's disease. So these are becoming more and more, I think people are becoming more and more aware of them, but then they're also becoming more prevalent. There's different forms of algae. There's the filamentous form of algae. That's the mat forming algae that looks sort of like cotton candy floating on the surface of a pond. And then there's planktonic algae. Planktonic algae is actually the base of the food chain, but if there's too much of it, it can cause your water to look really green. And then it can also form a slime on the surface in extreme cases. And then there's actually macrophytic algae. It's often mistaken for plants. Chara is a pretty common one that it looks like a plant, but if you rub it between your fingers, it feels really gritty and it smells kind of like rotten garlic. So now we'll talk a little bit about integrated pest management. So there's 6 basic tenets of integrated pest management. Everybody likes to go right to number 6 using, right to the chemical control, but there are a lot of other factors and things that you would want to consider first. Obviously, no action is just that. And if we're dealing specifically with invasive species, that's not desirable. So prevention, this is maybe a little bit more applicable to large water bodies, especially the boat cleaning and the access restriction, but monitoring is really important. It's so much easier to deal with plant infestations when they're new and rather than when you've just really got a big problem on your hands. And then also if you're going to be planting plants around your pond, just be careful about plant selection. Make sure you focus on native species and make sure that there's, especially in aquatic plant nurseries, there are a lot of aggressive species that can kind of hitchhike along with those plants. Mechanical removal is just that. It's the physical removal of vegetation. It can be a really effective control measure for certain species. However, there are species like hydrilla and like Eurasian water milfoil. Those plants reproduce by fragmentation is one of the modes of reproduction. So if you're not very careful as you're removing a plant and they're breaking apart and floating around, you can actually they can proliferate because of those activities. So just know your species before you implement that strategy. A lot of different physical practices. Obviously, dredging removes a lot of organic matter, improves water quality, removes some plant reproductive parts, very expensive and invasive. Drawdown, there's certain plants that can be susceptible to drawdown either by desiccation or from freezing, but again, doesn't work on every species. Benthic barriers, that's where you kind of cover the photic zone with black or dark material to prevent the sunlight from getting down there. It's great in theory, but it's not very easy to implement. So light attenuation and shading, that is using aquatic dyes to try to reduce the amount of sunlight penetrating into the water column. Again, it's not a magic bullet. It's a tool in the toolbox, but in certain programs and for certain species, it can have some efficacy. And then there's aeration. I'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. Aeration is not going to be a solution for your submersed rooted species. It's more effective for algae and for some of your free floating species. But the way that it works is it increases oxygen levels, which prevents that the phosphorus from releasing from the sediment. And then it also enhances the activity of the beneficial bacteria that break down organic matter. So there's a lot that can be, it really just improves water quality overall throughout the water column. And, you know, as a bonus, there's waterfowl are very dependent on open water habitat, especially in the winter. So that can be a good thing for waterfowl. There's a couple of different types of aeration strategies. There's your floating fountains and surface aerators. Those work by just directly entraining oxygen into the water column. Be careful though, floating fountains are generally decorative and they're not really going to do a whole lot to oxygenate the water column. Whereas on the right there, that's a surface aerator that's moving a lot more water and can do a much better job. The prettier it looks, the less benefit it has. And again, this is more effective in shallower water bodies because you're only getting that surface agitation. Then there's diffused air systems. They work by pumping air into the water, and as the bubbles rise up to the surface, they're actually circulating the water that way. But kind of the opposite of the surface aeration, you actually do need significant water depth for the diffused air to work, at least 4 feet, but 6 or 8 feet's even better. Cultural methods are probably what we have the most control over, not using a lot of fertilizer in the areas around ponds, having a vegetated buffer around the shore. I think it looks pretty. It acts as a filter. It stabilizes the shoreline. It provides habitat. So there's a lot of really, we definitely recommend having a buffer around most water bodies. Creating forebays at the entrance to pond areas, that kind of acts as a filter. It slows down the water and allows some pollutants and sediment to settle out of the water before it gets into the pond. And then just making sure that there's no unstabilized or eroded areas around the pond. Soil carries nutrients with it. So trying to get bare areas stabilized is really important. Biological controls. We talked about the beneficial bacteria that break down that organic matter. You can actually inoculate a pond with additional bacteria that help break down that organic matter. So again, that's not going to be helpful for your rooted species, but can work well for algae and algae and your floating plants. Triploid grass carp is another biological control. It's a non-native species that's bred to be triploid, and they do eat some species of submersed plants, but not all species. I think they can be overused and they can cause some water quality degradation, but in certain instances, they can be very effective. And then finally, on to the chemical control strategies. Nutrient remediation is binding that phosphorus. It's using rare earth minerals to make it so that the phosphorus in a pond, in the sediment and in the water column is not biologically available. So these, we can use products, Utrizorb, Phoslock, and Alum are some of the products that we use. And again, these are not going to do anything for your hydrilla or your Eurasian water milfoil, but certainly for algae issues, it can be very helpful. And then herbicides and algicides. There's a couple of different types of herbicides. Your contact herbicides work pretty quickly, but you have to spray them right on the plants, and they tend to be most effective on annuals because they are only killing the vegetation that they're actually interacting with. Whereas systemic herbicides, they work much more slowly, but they do translocate through the plant. So if you spray the leaves, they actually get carried through the plant tissue. And they tend to be a little bit more selective than your contact herbicides. And they do work well on both annuals and perennials. However, for any kind of herbicide management, and there's a lot that goes into it. It's not just as simple as walking into the co-op and asking the guy behind the counter what you should buy. There's a lot of, obviously plant identification, absolutely the most important, but a lot of the water body characteristics are important to know. Size and depth couldn't be more important for determining the rate of the product that you're putting in the water. Flow is important, especially for some systemic herbicides. You want to make sure that it's not just leaving the pond after you apply it. And then water temperature can definitely affect the efficacy of certain herbicides. There are water use restrictions with many herbicides. The most common one is for irrigation. So if you put it in the water and then water your tomatoes, it's not going to end well. So make sure you understand what the water use restrictions are for any herbicides you're putting in the water. Plant characteristics, extremely important. You need to know, how does that plant reproduce? And again, it's always easier to get it in its infancy when it's in the early stages of growth rather than when it's mature. And you would definitely have a different strategy for a spot treatment or a margin treatment versus a whole lake treatment. And then water quality, probably really important. Dissolved oxygen, especially if you're putting an herbicide into a water body that has compromised dissolved oxygen, you can definitely cause a fish kill from that. So be careful there. Certain herbicides don't work well in turbid water. They just bind to the soil particles and lose efficacy. And there are also certain herbicides that are extremely sensitive to pH and alkalinity. So those would be important characteristics to understand. So I think that was all I had.
Hey, well, thank you, Shannon. That was really informative. And now I'm going to ask Kevin Heffernan to go ahead and share his screen, and he will talk a little bit more in depth about TRAPA.
Thanks, Beth and Shannon. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm going to pull up my presentation. I'll be talking about two-horn TRAPA. And I'm going to use a recently published web page that we published. I'm with the Department of Conservation and Recreation, Division of Natural Heritage. And this web page is called a story map. And it's one page, but it does have links, and it kind of reveals things as you scroll along. And I decided, oh, I'm going to try this as a PowerPoint because it's a little more dynamic and it's got the freshest info we have right now. So two-horn trappa was recently introduced to Virginia less than 15 years ago, so far as we know. But before I get much more into that, I just want to mention Department of Conservation and others use a kind of a technical definition of invasive species, which are non-native plants, animals, or pathogens that cause economic and or ecological harm. We go through, for plants, we go through an extensive risk assessment process to label plants as invasive. At the end, I'll include some links in the chat for seeing our whole invasive plant list, which is also currently under review and updating. Shannon did mention some distinctions. So in your home ponds, many times you will have native plants that are causing problem for your particular goals. But we distinguish invasive as those, again, that are non-native, introduced and running rampant in the landscape, and then causing a range of management problems to human and non-human life alike. So two-horn trappa, aquatic, rooting, annual plant. Let's see, I'm remembering how to use Zoom, so I need to make more room on my screen. Here we go. First documented in 2014 in Pohick Bay in Northern Virginia. So this is a story map. We use a lot of maps in the story map, and they're all interactive, dynamic. You can scroll out now and see where this first occurrence that we know about as Trappa bispinosa. It had been mistaken for a closely related species that I'll talk about as well. And it looks like this. They float, the leaves float on the surface in a lovely rosette of leaves, these deltoid-shaped leaves with a kind of coarse tooth on two sides of the leaf. And the underside of the leaf is a kind of purpley red, which apparently also gets on your fingers and hands when you do a lot of pulling, which some of us have. And it has a little beautiful pink flower, pinkish flower. And these characteristics are important. First, this plant doesn't look like too many other plants that we have in Virginia, but it does look a lot like, virtually the same as another invasive trappa that I'll show you in a minute, Trappa natans, or Eurasian water chestnut. So the threat of this species is it quickly establishes in and roots in soil depth in the pond as deep as 11 to 15 feet. So it can grow its root up through that much water, and then it begins spreading out on the surface in these rosettes of leaves that fill in and begin blocking light, and of course from underneath sucking up nutrient, and so inhibiting growth of other native plant species and possibly changing the habitat for any wildlife in that pond. So the spread, and this is what makes this a very alarming invasive plant, because it has a ingenious vector or means of getting about. Plants can't walk, but they can attach themselves to things that do. And the way this plant does is by having these seed pods, actually, that each contain one seed, that have these interesting barbs that can attach to kayak ropes and more, which I'll show you in a second. Currently, distribution, and this is after now a little over 10 years of documenting this species, it's in over 120 ponds that we know about in Northern Virginia, now also in Maryland, and as far south as Charlotte County. And here's another fun aspect of this story map. We can have these kind of bookmarked points of interest. So you can see, we can zoom into our first introduction site, newly reported sites in Maryland. So if you know folks in Maryland up there around Greenbelt, tell them to keep an eye out for this plant. And then last year also, it was a year of bad news with Trappa. It leapt this distance, and we're not sure quite how it did that. Though the way it does attach to things it seems to be most frequently attaching to Canada geese. And Canada geese, of course, not only have feet, they have wings. So they're able to transport it generally 2 to 3 miles, but maybe in this case, even further. But there could be some other vectors. It could have been somebody traveling back and forth between Northern Virginia and Charlotte County. Those are the two most likely vectors for that. So again, back to the current range that we know of. This data also you can find on our TRAPPA dashboard, which I'll demonstrate here in a minute. That will help you if you're a landowner in this area. You can help, you can A, be on the lookout for it, of course, but B, this tool can help you determine how at risk your pond currently is. So early detection, very important to this. We are in the early detection phase, and yet it is already spreading widely, already a big problem, already costing tens, thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to manage. The state has been working for several years to get funding, dedicated funding for this. And I think I heard VDAX yesterday say correctly that they do have money this year. The program, I think it was approved late, so they got a late start, but I think they will be doing some control this fall and then hopefully continue that next year. You can, from this page, make a report to us, and then we can pass that on to people like Scott and VDAX and others who are working on response. Treatment ranges from good old mechanical hand pulling, raking, dragging, and then Scott and Shannon can maybe pipe in at the end about chemicals that are best to use now. Regulation of TRAPPA. Currently, we are still waiting for a very long listing process through VDAX, Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. Through their noxious weed law, we are listing this as a noxious weed, and we are currently waiting for the final approval to list this as a noxious weed, in which case we'll be able to regulate it, but also hopefully get more attention and resources aimed at controlling and managing it. A little bit of history. So you might have heard of water chestnut, and this is not the water chestnut you might get in your Chinese stir fry. This is a whole different species, and people do eat it, but I don't recommend it. This was a species that was introduced 100 years ago into the Potomac, and you can see, if you can see this little picture here, choking. That's the main body of the Chesapeake. Of Potomac River, and that's what we don't want TRAPPA bispinosa, two-horn TRAPPA, to do to the Potomac or any other water body. And it took a good number of decades to control that, and it was virtually eradicated. And then it made a reappearance, was fought again, and now just currently in Maryland is in 2 water bodies where they have an annual rodeo, basically to pull that plant out of the water. But fortunately, it has not spread back into the Potomac or other large water bodies. Here's a picture of a single TRAPPA seed, thus 2-horned TRAPPA. And then at the end of these little horns, it has this filamentous barbs that are, as you saw in that other picture, very good at catching onto ropes, catching onto goose feathers, on researchers' ankle, boots, whatever it can grab, it will grab and move from the pond it's in to a new habitat. So the effort in Pohick Bay, where Department of Wildlife Resources, oh my dear, there's I'm still using the name Game and Inland Fisheries, but that's actually now Wildlife Resources. Oh, it does say that there, okay. Pulled out 12,000 pounds of TRAPPA plants in a 2-year period. It's a very productive species, and it is annual, so it's reproducing all that biomass annually. So it's very difficult once it gets established, and then the seeds can linger on and germinate. We know at least right now for at least 5 years in the water, in the sediment. So it'd be a lingering problem that will require persistence and ongoing management. So this number's already has to be, oh, that was 2018, sorry. 2018, we knew about 33 water bodies. I'm going to skip forward to 2022, 130. Again, currently state level, we are working on getting dedicated funds for control. Fairfax County is working hard on this. The Northern Virginia Soil and Water District is working hard on this, and both of them have funds dedicated to that effort. We don't have good funding sources yet right now, although they're coming for private landowners. But that is coming through Virginia Department of Agriculture. So keep an eye out for that. I don't know if they've opened the application process for that. Maybe Scott will know that. And there is a TRAPA task force, so we do have a management plan. And I just want to quickly show you this and then open up for questions. Is this dashboard app that gives you a little more information as you're looking at a map. So the previous like hotspots area was nice visually, but not necessarily telling you what you're looking at. So here right now, and just in this view, there are 211 known occurrences. Those aren't necessarily populations, but occurrences that have been mapped. And you can see down here on the bottom, potentially infested 1,500, there are 1,500 ponds in this zone here. And as you zoom in, then you will see sharper delineation of where a location, an occurrence is. And you'll see some stratification of the ponds. So here's a known site, and all the known ponds within a mile radius are in red. And then the 2 mile radius is in green. So you can get a sense here looking at your pond, what the danger level is, how much you should be getting some interfering information. All right. And let's see, yes, it will work. Okay. Sometimes when you're in Zoom, certain functions don't work. So that's working. So that's the dashboard. Again, helpful if you're trying to assess your pond, but we also use it to plan our surveys. So this year we're going to be surveying out along this edge and into Loudoun County, and we're also going to go down to Charlotte County and look around these locations. There were 2 or 3 ponds down here, but as you can see, just within that mile radius, and that's well within the goose transport zone, as I call it, so easily transported without even human help at this point. So that is all from me. I will put this link in the chat, and then I think it's Rod is going to moderate questions for us, and Shannon and Scott, feel free to jump in, particularly with current control methods questions. Where is my Zoom now? Okay.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah. I'm here.
Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm going to
really
unshare
appreciated
this
all that information
if I can.
And yeah, so you're going to share that in the.
I'm going to try to unshare the screen without suddenly leaving the meeting. I can't. You are sharing the screen.
Okay.
It is okay. So yeah, I don't know why. Every time I've used Zoom, it's all new. So.
Well, so I'll let you work with that and share the resources that you had. I want to really quickly introduce Rod Walker, who's the president of Ridge PRISM, and I can't resist saying that he is also the 2023 Virginia Tree Farmer of the Year. So congratulations, Rod. He will be the moderator for the question and answer period, and I'm just going to leave it to him to ask the questions now for our panel.
Cool. Well, thank you, Rowena. Thank you to the presenters. This is fascinating material. And thank you all for attending today. You know, while we're just finishing up with TRAPA here, let me just ask the obvious question, if you will, that somebody also submitted when they registered, which is, okay, so if I have some TRAPA, any of the TRAPAs showing up in one of my ponds, what do I do? Is there something I can do to get rid of it? What are the recommendations?
Well,
maybe Scott can fill in kind of a bit of what he's doing, and then Shannon, if you want to add to that, since you've probably controlled more of it than anyone we know right now.
yeah, part of it depends on how large the infestation is and how big the pond is. And always keep safety in mind when you're doing this. Just need to say that pond bottoms can be really mucky, surprisingly so. And just to walk from like one side of a pond to the other can be quite exerting, especially when it's like hot and humid outside. But it can be pulled. It can be harvested mechanically like they did on the Potomac. The Army Corps of Engineers did back in the 40s on the Potomac River. Herbicide use, drawdown, there's lots of ways. The two most common would be just pulling it. You can do that at any time of year. It starts to sprout in April or May, but the seeds, they don't all germinate at once. So even if you think you pulled it all in, say, June or something, you can come back, a month later and still see trap on the surface because it sprouts continuously throughout the growing season. So it needs to be continuously done throughout the season. And as Kevin mentioned, even follow up in other years because some of the seeds lie dormant in the soil for a while if they, as long as they remain moist. Another way is herbicide use. It's good to hire a professional for that one. There are different herbicides that people use. I'm not sure how much research has been done on it, but to my knowledge, flumioxazin, I can type that in the chat if you want. Flumioxazin, the trade name is Clipper. It provides like 86 to 96% control, according to some research done by a colleague. That would be applied to the leaves, so you spray it. There's a good subsurface treatment, which is fluorpyroxafen benzyl. Procelicor is the name. I'm pretty sure it's expensive because you need like special training to do it. You have to be a licensed applicator and you need special training besides. It's also very effective. It's applied to the water column. So subsurface treatment means you apply it soon after the plants emerge in the spring. I think it lasts for a few weeks. The thing with chemical treatment is the plants that sprouted back in April and May are right now in August producing mature fruit. At this time, those plants aren't producing, they're not putting much energy into growth like they were a couple of months ago. They're now putting a lot of energy into reproduction. So therefore, they're not going to take up as much herbicide as they would have earlier in the season. We also don't know for sure what happens to the seeds when the plant is treated. There's research being done on that right now. They might be affected negatively. We don't know. But I need to say that because if you're spraying a plant, but it's already got mature seeds, ready to drop, you might not be doing a whole lot. Yeah, you're going to kill the plant, but those seeds might remain viable for next year. Those younger plants, though, that just sprouted, just a few weeks ago, don't have reproductive parts and will still, take up that herbicide. So I hope that makes sense. So two options, basically chemical or manual. Be careful of those seeds, they're sharp. And the old seed pods that might be floating around are sharp too. But those are the two main methods.
Cool. Excellent. Shannon, do you have anything you wanted to add?
I agree with everything he said. I think the important points, we use flumioxazin primarily. We found that to be the most effective strategy. I completely agree that we typically try to treat as early in the season as we can. And then monitoring is really important because, as Scott said, later in the season, there are going to be some seeds that didn't germinate, especially in more mature populations. So you're going to have a later season treatment as well. So ideally, if you do that spring treatment, shut down the plant growth before the seeds develop. And then again, maybe a mid to later season treatment right when you start seeing the plants. And ideally you can just kill the plants before the seeds develop, and eventually you can just through attrition get control of the plants. And we've done it successfully in a lot of water bodies, but that's where we have management programs, and we are just going out there every single month monitoring and treating as necessary if there's just a few plants, pulling them out of there. I would agree that probably contacting a professional for treatment is probably the best approach rather than DIY for a few reasons. The flumioxazin is extremely sensitive to pH, so you have to understand the water quality in order to be able to use that product. And again, the Procelicor, that product is not widely available to homeowners. It can only be purchased by people that have gone through the specific training for using it. So, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I've got 5 ponds on my property. I'll tell you, I'm going to be keeping a lookout for these.
Yeah, monitoring is the absolute best thing you can do. And I've had some of our customers call and they have a pond that's 100% covered with water chestnut, and they swear it wasn't there the year before. And my guess is it was there. It was probably just a few plants that they didn't notice, and then now it's everywhere.
So I've got quite a variety of questions here, and we're not nearly going to have time for all of them. Let me just pick a few here. One of them says, "Hey, I used an app called Picture This, and it told me my small pond has common duckweed. Is there a way to know that it really is duckweed? And is this a serious invasive?"
I can address that one. I mean, duckweed generally, if you use the state's definition, as Kevin was talking about earlier, we wouldn't say it's an invasive because it is a native species, but that doesn't mean it's not aggressive. It is extremely aggressive. And, you know, it's a little small, round, flattened plant that has little roots protruding out of the bottom of it. There's not really anything else that looks like it. I would say Seek, it should be a pretty, or even iNaturalist, those apps should be pretty reliable in the identification. It couldn't really be mistaken for very many other things. But I would say if you have a duckweed problem in your pond, definitely try to get it early. It can be very difficult to control once it becomes widespread. It can be somewhat helped by aeration a little bit, just to reduce the nutrients. It really likes a lot of nutrients, and it definitely, you know, aeration can help, nutrient mitigation, and then, you know, herbicides would be a backup plan there.
Yeah, I would second the use of iNaturalist. It's a great app and community and way to learn not only just about invasives or weedy or aggressive species, but just all your wondrous life forms you'll find that cross your path. And it's very straightforward to use. You'll get a quick response, maybe quicker than if you just send directly to me. So I'm just one person answering some of these questions. So with the iNaturalist, it's a very large community. You get a quick response. Picture This, I find mostly accurate. But I'm a botany nerd, and I work with people that wrote the Flora of Virginia, so I see things and differences that maybe most people don't. But it is definitely a good first step to try that out. But it usually will show you 2 or 3 different plants, so you do want to check the details of each of those suggestions and see if there's one that is obviously more accurate than the other. Sometimes just the shape of a leaf, the color of the flower, or where it's growing might be clues to whether or not the response that Picture This gives you is accurate or not. So yeah, that's probably all we have time for.
So we've talked about some plants like the Trapa that are in rivers and also in ponds. Is it generally the case that all these kinds of plants that we're going to talk about, whether it's parrot feather or hydrilla, et cetera, that they all, you know, populate both the streams as well as the ponds, or are some of them really, you know, mostly pond denizens and others are mostly stream denizens? I mean, what's the mix here?
one of my biology professors said, never say never, never say always. So some species will be in both habitats. Many are adapted to one or the other. I feel right now we're very lucky that we've only seen Trappa bispinosa really in one moving water body. And largely it seems to prefer ponds. But many of these species, like many people have been asking about parrot feather, can be in both. So the important thing really is just get a positive ID and go from there.
So you mentioned parrot feather. I mean, somebody asked, so what's the best way to get that out of a small spring-fed pond?
I can take that one. Mechanical removal can have some efficacy, but that's when you need to be really careful because it does reproduce by fragmentation. So if you only have a little bit of parrot feather, just be extremely careful about making sure you're removing all of the plant parts and scraps, so to speak. And if you have a much larger infestation and herbicide application, and really the Procellacor is what we have found to work the best on that. But again, that's not available easily to homeowners.
So is anybody aware of any funding that's available to landowners to help pay for the removal of any of these plants from their ponds or streams?
Not currently. I believe the program that VDAX is setting up will help with Trappa, and different species have come in and out of, actually, I was going to say fashion, but that's not right. It's really more a matter of what kind of funding the state is able to procure for doing that kind of work. So, so currently there's very little funding just to go through the state to private landowners. Just the reality of where we are. And we have made requests, but it really helps a lot if private citizens make the requests and make the demand for that kind of assistance. Generally, I am in the government, but I'm a voice in the wilderness there. So we can make all kinds of recommendations, and generally we're the last people anyone asks. So so it's very good for informed public to ask their lawmakers what they are doing, what they're planning for, and tell them what you would like to see in terms of assistance with invasive species. Invasive species are not just somebody's personal problem, and they're not always just a personal aesthetic or hygiene problem you might have. It's a widespread social problem mainly because of our global economic system now. And I'm not blaming that, but it is a side effect of that. When we are moving so much material around the earth, it is inevitable that accidentally or intentionally, species will hitch a ride and find a new habitat, and in a way that's nobody's fault. So Trappa is one of those. We don't know how it got here. Wavy leaf basket grass, another one. We don't know how it got here. So it's a factor of just humans moving around and moving stuff around. And so it shouldn't be anyone's personal problem. It should be it's a social problem.
Yeah, fascinating. So a lot of people are asking about specific plants in different sizes of lakes and ponds, and we've talked about different ways of treating them. So what's the end result? I mean, in most cases, and never say always or never, in most cases, can with diligent treatment, is it possible to actually eradicate any of these weeds out of your ponds? I mean, can you really get rid of them so that, hey, after some number of years, you no longer have to worry about that plant in your pond anymore?
You can, at least with some of them. It takes persistence, takes a lot of effort, patience, but it can be done. There are others, I don't know, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe duckweed or watermeal. They're so tiny and so prolific. You're not going to get every last one, I think. And so there's some that may be harder to get rid of. but it can be done. And in the case of something like two-horn trappa, it's still relatively range limited in the US that maybe we can eradicate it entirely. Need to get on that before it gets really common, because then the cost gets so great. It skyrockets. But yeah, you can get rid of stuff in your own pond, especially if it's a smaller one.
Shannon, what do you say? What do you say to that?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I do agree that there's certain species it's much more difficult to achieve that. I mean, that's why our company offers management programs, because of that very thing. It's like any invasive plant. It always surprises me that people are willing to treat poison ivy time and time again and aren't surprised when it comes back, but then they call us to treat an invasive plant in their pond, and then they call us back furious that it's reappeared. And so it is, exactly what Scott said, just diligence, persistence, and monitoring is key. Just make sure you're keeping an eye out for things and trying to control them before they become really well established.
So, I mean, if you have a 2 to 10 acre pond, are any of these easy to get rid of? In other words, are there, even though you've got a lot of it, are any of these plants ones where, hey, you treat it 2 or 3 times or whatever in the course of the summer, and most of the time, most ponds, one season and it's gone? Do any of them really work that way?
In our experience, it's not going to be done. There are certain plants, water shield, for instance, that Procelacor herbicide works very well on it, where we have had instances where we've gone in and done one treatment, and then for a couple of years nothing came back. But just as many times, and probably more times, we've treated it 2 or 3 times and have just continued to battle it, even with diligence and maintenance. It varies between, it depends on substrate, water depth, nutrient levels, water quality, weather, so many different flow, lots of different factors.
So yeah, but before Rowena cuts me off here with the time, I'm just going to put in one really quick plug for Solitude. I've got 5 ponds. I've used them over the years to both for general advice to help get rid of weeds, and actually, interestingly enough, to stock unusual fish. So they've helped me get smallmouth bass and various other things, right up including walleye, perch, and even tiger muskies to put in my pond. So I've always enjoyed working with them.
Thanks for that.
Thank you, Rod. Great moderating. And thank you, Scott, Shannon, and Kevin. We are out of time. And I know that there are a lot more questions that people wanted to ask. And so I apologize for those who didn't get their questions answered. I will ask the panelists to take a look at those questions. And if you can type in a quick response, please.
I did type in a few, just to let you know.
Yeah, I saw that, Kevin. And there were some about what native plants can you plant to help have a better habitat. And if one person has some invasive water invasives, but they also have salamanders in their pond, and they want to know what if they will be hurt if they treat that. So I'm just going to ask the panel to just take a look at some of those questions, and if they can answer some of those for you, they will. Really quickly, if you have any more questions for us or want to know more about Blue Ridge PRISM, what we do, our future programs, please go to our website, www.blueridgeprism.org. If you want to contact us, the best email to reach us is at info@blueridgeprism.org. And of course, we can't do any of this work without you and your donations. So please consider donating to Blue Ridge PRISM to help us keep the word out to the public about invasive plants. You can follow us on a number of social media platforms. And once again, if you'd like to reach us, info@blueridgeprism.org to volunteer as well and to contact us. We really appreciate that. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Scott, Kevin, and Shannon. You really taught us a lot. And at the end of this, there's going to be a survey that pops up on your screen. If you can just take a moment to fill that out. This is directed at our audience. It's just so we know how we can improve our presentations for you in the future. We would really appreciate that. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.
About the Q&A, Rowena, when we type something in, does everyone see that, or does it just go to that one person?
It goes to everyone if you,
good.
it goes into answered if you answer it.
Okay, good.
So you can do that. But well, thank you, everyone. We still have a few people hanging on, and I will stop the sharing. Beth, I realize now that I never introduced you, and I absolutely apologize. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it is okay. I was just lurking in the background, so no problem.
And so thanks. Do you guys want to talk about anything else, or ready to head on out?
I've always got more questions for these guys. I mean, if I plant a buffer of native aquatic plants around the shallower shore of the pond, does it actually help to keep others from taking hold?
Other plants specifically?
Yeah. Does it help prevent other invasive plants from taking hold in the pond if I've kind of filled the shallow areas with native plants already?
It can definitely help, but as we all know, part of the problem with invasive species is that they outcompete the natives. So certainly better to have native plants than nothing. I wouldn't discourage that by any means, but certain plants can still get a foothold if even in the presence of native plants, unfortunately.
Yeah, I haven't read a lot of that in a pond aquatic situation. In places like in marshes where we do Phragmites control, native plants do come back after that control without having to do any extra planting. But it's continued vigilance, and I think that's the underlying message, probably for humans since we began agriculture and into the Anthropocene. So yeah, and we're all doing primary research now.
Yeah, right. Well, hey, thank you, everybody. This has been great. I think people were really appreciative of it, and a lot of good information.
Yes, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy people, and really thoughtful answers to a lot of the questions. And so thank you so much.
And Shannon, since you're new, where are you based?